So this Man Booker challenge is getting a bit ridiculous. In order to get through the books, I need to read and record videos while I'm on holiday. And my holiday is being spent in mountain huts in the Alps. So I am currently at 2,200 metres, which is about 6,500 feet for Americans, in the Italian Alps in a mountain hut. And if you listen really carefully, you'll be able to hear some Italians behind the door of the next room. You may even manage to hear the rain outside. It's absolutely pouring down. And if it carries on raining like this, then the climbing that we're meant to be doing tomorrow is not going to work. But in the time since we arrived here this afternoon and the rain starting, I sat outside, looked at a beautiful view and read Donal Ryan's From a Low and Quiet Sea. Clearly losing my mind, as well as not being able to record properly up here. From a Low and Quiet Sea. So this is the first of the Booker Prize books I have read this year. Donal Ryan is an author who has had great acclaim for his first few novels. So this, I think, is his fourth novel, and he's also published a collection of short stories. And he's published those in quite a quick period of time, I think. The Spinning Heart, which was the first one, the only other one I've read by him, won the Guardian First Book Award not that many years ago. So he's been pretty prolific. And I went for this novel first off the list because it was a writer that I've heard of, and as I said, there were many writers on the list I hadn't heard of. So it is this book has 4 sections. It starts with a man called Farouk, who is a Syrian doctor in Syria at the beginning of his section, who decides to get his family to safety and becomes one of the refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean in unsuitable boats. Section 2 is set in Ireland. The main character is a young man called Lampy in his early 20s, who is probably not that bright, still at home, living at home with his mum and his grandpa. There's been some sort of tragedy in the family in the past, which nobody talks about and which Lampy doesn't really know about. And it's, for those of you who've read The Spinning Heart, it's a very similar sort of narrative. It is very, very Irish. There's a lot about Catholicism. There's a lot about Catholic guilt. There's a lot of Irish idiom in there, so we get Lampy's life and his attempts to get over the girlfriend that he's lost and enjoy spending time with the girlfriend he has at the moment. We then move into a third section, which is from the point of view of a man called John, also in the same town in Ireland. And this is an interesting section of the book. It is a sort of pseudo-confession. He is, having failed to confess his sins properly as a child in a Catholic school with a Catholic priest, he is now confessing his sins to the reader. And the language is sort of pseudo-religious and slightly old-fashioned in places. So there's a sort of atmosphere of religiosity that comes from slightly weird sentence structures. But he is sort of trying to confess the terrible things he's done in his life, and he was originally an accountant, then became a lobbyist, and is a rich man living in Ireland. And then the final section, Lake Islands, brings a number of the characters together into a story which has a bit of a dramatic event at the end, which I won't tell you about. So that's the main structure of the novel. It reads almost like 3 novellas and then a bit that pulls it together, rather than a more cohesive novel. The first 3 sections have no explicit connection to each other, although all the characters, or maybe all but one of the characters, do appear in the final section, so it does bring it together in that way. But the sense I had when reading it was much more that it is a series of novellas which were not necessarily very strongly linked. And I think that was my problem reading this book. Ryan writes utterly beautifully. He has these gorgeously pretty sentences. He doesn't put a foot wrong on his beautiful sentences through the whole of this book. but through quite a lot of it, he doesn't really seem to be saying very much. There's clearly a thread that runs through about the effects that tragic losses can have on people. And that's actually brought out quite explicitly at one stage. I'm generally of the view that in any novel, there is usually a line somewhere in which the writer sort of tries to tell you what it is that the novel is trying to say. With my writer's hat on, I know I think about lines like that and how the reader will suddenly understand that this is what the novel's about. But I think there's one of these lines in the section from John's point of view, where he talks about a man, a kind of tramp, I suppose, who stayed in a garret at the top of the building I lived in. I don't know if he even paid rent. All I knew then was that at some point he'd lost something or someone, and the loss had shattered him. And what this novel is about is losses that shatter people. But the losses are not necessarily... The narrative that surrounds those losses is not necessarily very interesting. And there were quite a lot of pieces of this novel that I felt quite strongly should have been cut by an editor. You can hear the Italians next door. Cut by an editor. And I'm going to give you a couple of these to give you a sense of what they are. So this one's from Lampy's section. And he's talking about his ex-girlfriend, Chloe. Chloe wouldn't have left him if he'd had a degree, a posh job, a whack of money every week, or every month. The posher your job, the less often you get paid. But he couldn't manage the maths, and the assignments he submitted always came back with low grades and red biro marks all over them. And Cookie Ryan, whom he travelled in and out with, tried to give him a hand. But the more he looked at things, the less sense they made, and he couldn't believe the amount of effort it took to just get one thing straight in his head, and then there'd be another thing waiting to be understood. And there's nothing wrong with that text, but it doesn't... advance the character. There's nothing. There's no subtexts beneath it. It feels as though it was almost first draft writing that should have been taken out when you get to the sort of cutting away, the paring away to the core of the novel. And that's not the only example of writing like that. There's a similar one in John's section. Where he is, in Lake Islands, in the final one, where an old woman is talking about what her great-grandson has sent her in the post. It was when he came to visit. He'd shown her his computer thing, a tablet he called it, and a thing you could press on to go into pictures of people, and he showed her all sorts of people and children and babies, and they were all relations of her, but she couldn't hold them in a line in her head in a million years. And he came to a photograph of a big round man with a baldy head and bright-coloured shorts standing holding a fish out beside him that was nearly the length of himself. And he'd said Grandad caught that in the Warra Warra or somewhere with a funny name like that, a river she presumed. And she'd gotten a terrible shock at the realisation that the old man in the picture was her son, and that this tall boy, who was half a step or less from manhood, wasn't her grandchild at all, but her great-grandchild. The same lad sent her a package the next Christmas. There was a box in it with an apple on the front of it, with a bite taken out of it. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not particularly insightful. If you set out to think, well, what might a really old woman be thinking when she saw Facebook for the first time, then it sort of does that. But there's nothing exciting in what's being said, and that sort of sense of beautiful writing but not a lot being said or nothing new being said, to me applied to 3/4 of this book. So it applied to the sections for Lampy, for John, and then the final section, Lake Islands, where it comes together. And I found it quite disappointing because the first section, Farouk, I thought was absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to read you a couple of sections from that to give a sense of just how different those were, if I can make my Kindle work, just how different those were compared to other the later sections of the novel. This book almost read to me as though Ryan had set out to carry on writing the sort of small-town Irish, beautifully written narratives that he had written before, or that in The Spinning Heart he's written before, and then he has added onto the front of it this wonderful narrative of the Syrian refugee, which doesn't really connect into the rest of the book at all, although Farouk is pulled into the narrative again at the end. But it did feel like an add-on, but for me it was by far the most impressive part of the book. So the book opens with a very beautiful description of trees. I realise that's a slightly odd thing for a book to start with. But it starts like this. Let me tell you something about trees. They speak to each other. Just think what they must say. What could a tree have to say to a tree? Lots and lots. I bet they could talk forever. Some of them live for centuries. The things they must see that must happen around them. The things they must hear. They speak to each other through tunnels that extend from their roots, opened in the earth by fungus, sending their messages cell by cell, with a patience that could only be possessed by a living thing that cannot move. It would be like me telling you a story by saying one word each day. At breakfast I would say it, the word of the story, then I'd kiss you and I'd go to work and you'd go to school and all you'd have of the story is that single word each day and I would give no more until the next day, no matter how you begged. And within that setting you have the beautiful pastoral. You also have the sense, the realisation that this is a father talking to a child, and a huge tenderness in that. And as it goes on, you realise it's the father putting the girl to sleep. And then you suddenly get this. He stopped on the short landing and watched her through the cracked door, shifting in her sheets to find the most comfortable way of lying. He could hear gunfire from the east, beyond the town, short of the front line. And suddenly you're now into a book about war in Syria. And what this reminded me of as I read it was the opening of Mohsin Hamid's Exit West, which was on the Booker long list and then the Booker short list last year. I didn't like that book, as you will see if you go back to my video about it. But it started off with this, the best bit for me actually was the beginning, in which people are in a town which suddenly shifts into, or gradually moves into war, and day by day more horrendous things happen, and what they are trying to work out is the right time to leave. And that's happening as well in Farouk's story at the beginning of this book, but it's much more subtle. You've got constant changing of emotions, none of which are remotely cliched, with Farouk's fears, his sense that maybe actually they should all just get on with it, and his wife and his daughter ought to be able to cope with being wrapped up and hidden all the time. Maybe that would be a better thing for all of them rather than undertaking a treacherous journey to get to Europe. The sense of pride he has in getting his family away, the shame he has when he realises that the journey which he paid over the odds for in order to get them a really good passage, it was something that he was tricked into doing. His fear that his wife is flirting with the people who are going to transport them. It's beautifully written, not at all cliched, emotionally really complex, and at the same time you have this father-daughter and husband-wife relationship in the middle of great peril. And I won't give the sort of twist away from what happens to Farouk and his family in that first section of the novel, but Farouk ends up in a refugee camp in southern Europe, as millions of refugees have done and still do, and the sort of emotions he feels and the madness that is going on in his brain after that sea crossing are very wonderfully described. It's a sort of PTSD type effect, but it's subtle, it's not cliched, it's complicated, and it has this beautiful writing in it. So I absolutely loved the first quarter of this book. I was then really quite disappointed when it shifted into Lampy and then John and then Lake Islands at the end, and the pulling together of the threads for me didn't really quite work. I did find myself wondering, was there some sort of big theme that I was missing here? The Italians are talking again. And let me know if you think there is. I mean, I do think there's this theme that big losses leave their mark on people. But that in itself didn't really account for the abruptness with which the threads were brought together at the end, and the fact that there is no overlap or connection between the narratives of Farouk and Lampi and John through their sections of the novel. It only comes together at the end. So to me, this didn't feel particularly cohesive, but the writing is beautiful, and the section on Farouk at the beginning I thought was fabulous and strongly recommend. Had it continued like that, I would have said that this was a shortlist book. As it didn't, I think it's probably not going to be on my shortlist, but we will see. I will move on to the next novel and see how it goes. I think next I'm going to read Sophie Mackintosh's The Water Cure, still in my mountain hut. So you may yet get another video with this strange sort of orange walls. I've got a load of climbing ropes and helmets and harnesses and things in here as well. So yes, I'll move on to the next book.